Good morning, trade professionals. Welcome back to the Simply Trade News Roundup, where we talk all things trade news, whatever news really they are that impact the trade industry. First off, though, before we start this segment, I want to wish everyone a happy Memorial Day because that is indeed today. And we want to thank our troops.
Well, and happy Memorial Day to everybody. And with that, let's take a moment also to stop and recognize our Gold Star families. Those are folks that have lost a family member that was in the military, and they paid the ultimate sacrifice. Also to our veterans and those that happen to be in the VA hospitals and whatnot, recovering from different ailments and injuries and whatnot. Again, folks, thank you so much for what you've done for us. And as we stop and think of what our military has done, including our Coast Guard, the Navy, the Marines, the Army, the Air Force, and we also have now Space Force. All said and done, thank you so much for what you're doing in the public eye as well as in behind things. So,
and all the people use today as the unofficial or official start of summer. Actually, if we just take a step back and just recognize everybody that has given up their lives for our country.
Thank you guys so much for bringing that up. It's so important to honor the troops. And one thing that the CrossFit community does, because if I haven't talked about it, but I do CrossFit here and there. Every Memorial Day, we get together in a gym that's around the world, and we do MRF, which is a workout to honor the troops. And some people even do it with a vest, which is crazy. I never do that with a vest, but it's running 1 mile. It's 100 push-ups, 200
pull-ups,
200 squats. No, 200 push-ups and 300 squats.
Yes.
Okay, and then another mile. Very tough. Right. Makes me die every single year. Not a fun workout, but it's definitely, when you think of why you're doing it, it's such a special workout to do. I feel
it's in memory of a Navy SEAL, Lieutenant Michael Murphy. That's why they call it the MRF.
MRF, yes, yeah, and I'm looking forward to do it. It shouldn't be threatful because you're doing it for a certain reason. So let's start on the first article, which we're going into. Indonesia's cargo pileup shows how protectionism can bite. So that is the article of the Bloomberg article, which basically talks on Indonesia walking back import restrictions following criticism from companies and consumers.
All right. So in the Bloomberg article, it's Indonesia has implemented in March some additional bureaucracy and for imports. So what it's come back to is, under the premise of protecting their own industries or protectionist type policies, they've implemented extremely bureaucratic and restrictive type imports, where a lot of commodities that are imported into Indonesia require permits or additional information, different additional paperwork and whatever. So you can imagine that as that was implemented again in March, it has dramatically delayed clearance of thousands upon thousands of commodities. And the net result of that is there are right now over 29,000 ocean containers that are backed up at the ocean ports. So in looking at that, so if you're a company that is selling goods and shipping them to Indonesia, you're probably caught up in the midst of this, because even if you had all the right information for your goods are going to be in the midst of everything else. And so the port is backed up. It's a bottleneck. And this is where things like this is that in theory, okay, you're going to protect your economy, but if you just arbitrarily put in a lot of bureaucratic steps and then just implement it and not really phase it in, as well as have sufficient staffing and lead times so people can provide the additional information, it's going to back up like this. So the problem is that Indonesia right now is just a mess as far as the clearance. And so in looking at that, you're going to need to start looking at potentially alternate means other than ocean, because the containers are really backed up. But the other side of that is just the sheer fact of it's going to take time to clear this out. So if you're shipping to Indonesia, you've got a problem on your hands right now.
Well, I think also it's a lesson learned for countries that, I mean, obviously, whoever listens to the podcast is not a policymaker in a country or anything. But I mean, the lesson learned also is that, ironically, while they are trying to, this is a protectionist move, of course, just to make sure that products that are made and manufactured in Indonesia are protected, or manufacturing companies in Indonesia are protected. But the ironic move is that because of those restrictions or limitations, exports are suffering dramatically too. I mean, the article pointed out that exportations have also gone down because
they can't get them out of the port.
Well, not only that, but they're counting on raw materials that are taking forever to get there, right, and so they're not able to manufacture that, and so there it's just a mess. I mean, like you said, Andy. I mean, in an effort to improve the countries, which I get it, of course, you kind of have to try to do that. I mean, we do it to a degree, but in an effort to protect your products, you're also hurting your products because you can't export, because you can't make this stuff. So,
well, one of the things that the article points out too is that in addition to the import rules and all that, they have also dramatically restricted the amount of goods that somebody can bring, like migrant workers or whatever, into the country. So in other words, for example, you're limited to 2 suitcases. And what I notice is only 2 pairs of shoes. So even if, I mean, it's crazy in that, because, the idea behind that, if you on the flip side, is they want you to buy goods made in Indonesia. All right, I understand that. However, this is where this was put together apparently by some people that really don't have a clue on how businesses are transacted. And having international transactions with buying and selling the goods actually stimulates your country. So, and it stimulates your economy. So in this scenario, on the surface, it sounds good, but unfortunately, they've used a shotgun approach to this whole thing rather than a sharpshooter. What do I mean by that? They have used these rules and regulations that are affecting about 70% of all imports, and it's just backing up the ports instead of zeroing in on what specifically is there a particular industry that's being hurt, rather than hitting everything. And so even domestic transactions in Indonesia are a problem, and the citizenship, most of them don't like these new rules, and there's been no solution thus far. So again, the net result, and I agree with you, if you're buying goods from Indonesia, to your point, Lalo, people can't get the raw goods in Indonesia to manufacture some of the widgets they're making to ship back out. So, and even if they had them, the port's backed up. So this is a vicious cycle here. So hopefully people can learn from this, as you just said, governments and others, that you can't just arbitrarily hit everything all at one time and expect it to run smoothly.
Now imagine, Andy, going into Indonesia and only being able to take your leather and your alligator boots. What the heck? Wear your snake boots, and you can't take the ostrich boots. You can't take the rest of them. You only limited to 2 pairs of boots.
It's like, oh my gosh, now I could have several of my cowboy hats, but I don't know. It's like only 2 pairs of boots, man. I was like, trip me down.
What are you going to do with yourself?
Yeah, very odd. So do you think we're going to, like, this is a story that'll carry on and we'll hear on this again, or?
Well, it's going to take quite some time to clear this up. The question is going to be, they're touting. Here's the other thing. It's interesting. There's statistics and real world. You can get your statistics a lot of times to report on all kinds of stuff, and they're touting this as that saying, oh, the first quarter growth in Indonesia is, one of the largest in a decade or whatever. And yet what people were trying to do is get goods into and out of Indonesia before all this, these new rules took effect. Well, now the problem is that you're going to see the negative effect, and I think it's really going to hurt the GDP, or gross domestic product, as we would call that, which is another word just for saying the Indonesian economy. So, yeah, we'll be watching this, but it's going to take, can you imagine 29,000 containers? Let's put that into perspective. On the West Coast, when there were, there would be 75 ships that were backed up waiting to get into the ports to unload. I mean, that was tens of thousands of containers, but it took a long time to get that out. It's all relative. It's what the capacity of those ports and all that. So 29,000 containers backed up, more trying to get in there, more trying to get out. It's a mess.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll have to wait for that one coming up. Okay, going into our loveliest topic is that the China Commerce Ministry recently announced restrictions on certain U.S. companies, preventing them from engaging in import and export activities related to China. I mean, it seems like China is just really trying to push the United States to where the U.S. has been pushing China, right? So basically, this includes a ban on new investments in China and arms sales to Taiwan. And one of the companies is actually Boeing Defense, Space, and Security. That's one of the firm that's affected by the ban. So what do you guys think? Yeah, what do you think on that?
Well, they're just retaliating against the U.S. and other countries. That, keep in mind, this Uyghur forced labor prevention, I think, is really hammering the heck out of the Chinese economy. And there are more and more of Chinese companies being listed as a threat with the use of forced labor. So this is just another way for China to retaliate against that, and they've put Boeing Defense and a few others, so that what that does is, well, these companies now are limited or cannot do business in China. So they're trying to be punitive against those companies. But again, this is just more saber rattling, more you're going to do that or I'm going to do this, and all that. So
yeah, and what I was going to say, that the increase of enforcement as well on we've been hearing a lot about this. It's been flying a little bit under the radar, only because we tend not to talk too much about it, although we have covered it quite a bit on the podcast with past guests. But like this last week, I was at a conference here locally in El Paso, and they were still talking quite a bit about it, which is like the importation of products with fentanyl. In other words, just trying to block that. And of course, China is one of the biggest manufacturers of that, and finding stuff like that, and just trying to block shipments, trying to block products that are coming from China, especially under the de minimis rule, that pretty much fly under the radar. And of course, us here in the U.S. trying to enforce it more, and indirectly just upsetting, the Chinese government that we're discriminating against them, but it really isn't. I mean, they just find things like that, in the sense of having to be able to enforce these rules because of, illicit drugs in this case.
Well, and to that point, I will say that I personally was heavily involved in writing some of the regulations for the de minimis, and it was raised from 200 to 800. Under no circumstances do I look at this and support what a lot of these countries are doing. They've looked at this de minimis as a loophole. And so I will tell you that from a personal standpoint, for companies to take advantage of the de minimis, there should be, in my opinion, sort facilities, advanced manifests, proper descriptions for all of that. So, and there should be reimbursables, as it's called, with customs. So it pays. Somebody comes in with containers of this low dollar stuff. They should be paying a reimbursable fee, just like the express carriers do, UPS, FedEx, DHL, and others, that funds the staffing of customs to review those manifests, process those things, and when they are selecting shipments for exam and all that kind of stuff, have the sort facility so they can present it. A lot of times they'll say, well, there's one shipment in the middle of the container. That's not customs' fault. That's the carrier. That's whatever. And that is where there's an unfair trade practice in that. And in my personal opinion, this is just Andy Shiles talking here, is that customs has had this tsunami of de minimis type shipments come in, and has somehow in this the requirements for all that to come in, that people are expecting just to process it and not do anything. I'm sorry, that doesn't work that way. So, in looking at it, I guess the only other side of that would be all these countries, especially China and others, but all these countries that are wanting to take advantage of that same de minimis issue should reciprocate and raise their own de minimis so that the U.S. and other countries can do the same thing in their countries. And they don't want to do that. Say, all right, then we're going to cut that off. So that's some of the challenges that we have in that.
And that leads us to the last article, which is also my favorite. Well, it shouldn't be a favorite. It's the most interesting to me, per se, because we see those cars on the streets every day, and it's something, we connect with a little bit more as regular people and not trade people. You know what I mean, right? When, because these kind of things like that we talk about usually are very, okay, when it came to the Baltimore Bridge, it was a little different because that, everyone kind of saw that in the news. But what we talk about is not something that's on the news every day or the news that we watch per se, because usually we, look at political news or just whatever it is, like different kind of news, not trade news as regular consumers or people. But this one is on forced labor in the BMW Mini Cooper components, so a recent U.S. Senate investigation has revealed the potential use of forced labor in the supply chains of Chinese manufactured BMW Mini Cooper vehicles, which is crazy. I always thought that they were like purely
British,
German,
or German
manufactured. Yeah, I just thought
it was a British design car.
It was.
Yeah.
It was originally,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, European at least, nothing from China, because everything I don't want to say cheap, but it seems more cheap than it is from Europe. So that was very interesting to me. And I do want to say that it would, so we have been talking about forced labor a lot. And there's a lot of resources that people can use to, find forced labor in your supply chain, though it seems that it's also something that is still developing and companies are not really sure how to do their best to prevent forced labor because it's so hard to get that information, from these other countries like China that are not very, being transparent with their supply chain, I guess, or what I feel like. So it's kind of crazy that such a huge company who has all the resources possible, who has so much money, is getting into this kind of dilemma, while these smaller businesses also have to make sure that they're not using forced labor, but they probably don't have the resources to find, to afford such greater resources to find forced labor in your supply chain. I don't know if that makes sense, because obviously we all are supposed to not have forced labor in any supply chain, but it is harder for smaller businesses to find that instead of larger business. Though I understand that a larger scale of a business obviously has so many more people working for you, and it's kind of hard to oversee, rather than a smaller business who kind of probably interacts with the people they're working with one by one. So I want to hear your take on this, where this is going to go, and how is this going to impact the future of forced labor? Because this seems like it would be a really big scandal.
I don't know if I would call it a scandal. I would just say that this is more of a scenario that
in the Gen Z world, it's a scandal. Okay.
Well. Yeah. All right. So let's put this in perspective. What's happened is BMW, who owns the Mini Cooper, manufactures the Mini Cooper, has a factory in China that apparently manufactures, the Mini Coopers for sale into the U.S. So that's not so much the problem itself as the factory, as it is there is a component, an electronic component, that is manufactured in the Uyghur area, and so it's again the assumption is it was manufactured with forced labor. The company that actually provides this electronic part is on the list, and apparently is notorious for utilizing forced labor. That part has been put into the Mini Cooper. Now, stop and think, how many parts are there in a Mini Cooper? There's thousands. So as this is coming across, and there may be others, I don't know, they're just looking into this. But the whole idea is that these Mini Coopers were manufactured. There were 8,000 of them that after this was discovered, 8,000 models were manufactured and still sent to the U.S. and imported into the U.S. by BMW, which the U.S. is saying that was in violation of the law. And BMW has committed to replacing those parts, or that one part on all those vehicles. It comes back around again to the forced labor scenario here, is that the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 supply chain vendors, you have to dig into it and see what's going on. This may have been going on all this time, and they're just now discovering that this particular vendor is using forced labor. That's one thing. So you've got to dig into it and see how far it goes, and then the repercussions thereof. Second, it's just another scenario here where, they've already got the factories. I understand that. But folks, if you are looking for a location to establish a factory to manufacture your goods, man, I tell you, there is a lot of tension with the U.S. and China and the rest of the world, quite frankly. And just be prepared. You're going to have a lot of extra headache, bureaucracy, extra tariffs at times, extra, information you're having to hold on to, and all of that just to deal with that. To me, it's like, is the low labor rates worth it? And in the low labor rates, is it because it's forced labor? So something to give some thought to. But that's where it's come up to where in this particular case, one part, it was discovered that supply chain in a tier 3 environment, it uses forced labor. And now look at the what it's doing to this whole situation.
Yeah, I just don't understand also in the sense that, like Andy said, like you said, Andy, it's a very small part, and it's a part amongst thousands of parts in a car. But the worst part, I think maybe this is inexcusable. Maybe that's why Annik says it's a scandal. But it may.
Well, it is a scandal. It shouldn't be happening, and it's like you wouldn't expect it to be. I think why it's a scandal for me is because you wouldn't expect this from such a.
Right. Well, you wouldn't. I mean, in a sense, you wouldn't. But I mean, I can kind of give it a pass when. We've talked about this before, when it's like cotton that came from China and it's in your shirt and you had no clue, you're just the guy that buys the cloth and you don't know. But that's
all of the companies too. Like everyone.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So in that case, I would give them a pass and say, well, I mean, they didn't know and now they know they need to go, many levels deep. In this one, I can see how it may be a little bit, how you can definitely say that only because that company was listed on it was on the list of known violators of forced labor, and so that one should have not even made it past the parts list, on the vendor site, on the purchasing site.
Get on the front end of this deal and look at it. And even though they may be able to offer a very low price to manufacture the widget, look at the whole situation, or holistically, as we would say. Look at your added transportation, all that, but then look at your added risk and from a compliance. And I'm telling you, this is one that's going to cost BMW a tremendous amount of money to clean up for this little part, as well as the PR on this thing. I mean, I got to tell you, this is not a good thing. It's like, BMW, apparently you're using, vendors that use forced labor and in the manufacturing your vehicle. That's not something you want to have to deal with.
Looking into our fun fact, so this is just not so Memorial Day fun fact, which is there are 15.5 million trucks in the U.S., but guess what? How many drivers there's only? There's only 3.5 million qualified truck drivers. The country's truck drivers are responsible for more than 70% of the total amount of freight transported in the U.S. And we hope that you have a memorable Memorial Day.
Memorable.
Oh
memorable Memorial Day.
Memorable Memorial Day. So, have some burgers, enjoy it with your family, and think of the people, that are in a bit different situations right now. So again, we will be back next Monday with some new articles. If you have any articles to share with us that you might want to for us to discuss, please send them our way. And we hope you have a great day.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.